Wildfires don't just happen, they spread where conditions make them inevitable. And in Texas, those conditions are multiplying. What if one spark could shut down an entire community in minutes? What if a single power line could ignite devastation across thousands of acres? And what if the risks that once seemed distant in California are now becoming Texas's new reality? These are not hypothetical questions. They are the urgent issues Texas faces in 2025. When Governor Abbott declared a wildfire disaster across 191 counties in August 2025, many asked, why Texas? Why now? After all, California, Oregon, and Colorado are the states most often associated with catastrophic fires. Texas, in popular imagination, is the land of cattle ranches, oil rigs, and thunderstorms, not megafires. Yet that image is dangerously outdated. Texas today is among the states most vulnerable to wildfire, and understanding why means looking at the state's geography, its climate, and the choices its people have made in where and how they live. Start with geography. Texas is huge, the second largest state in the US by both land and population. Within its 268,000 square miles, it contains multiple ecosystems. Pine forests in the east, the grassy panhandle, dry desert scrub in the west, oak savannas in the hill country, and coastal plains along the Gulf. Each of these environments has one thing in common: they burn. Natural fire cycles once kept them balanced, clearing old vegetation and making way for new growth. But when fire is suppressed for decades, when drought intensifies, and when more people move into high-risk areas, the natural cycle becomes fuel for catastrophe. The second factor is climate. Texas has always been a state of extremes, but in recent years those extremes have sharpened. Summers are hotter than ever, with repeated stretches of triple-digit days. Rainfall patterns are shifting, periods of heavy storms followed by long droughts, a pattern scientists call weather whiplash. This means that in spring, rains may produce thick grass growth, only for summer heat to bake that grass into perfect kindling. Then all it takes is a spark, a lightning strike, a car accident, or a power line fault. Within minutes, flames leap across the dry ground, carried by winds that can turn a small blaze into a fast-moving inferno. Third, there is population growth. Texas has grown faster than almost any other state in the country, adding millions of new residents over the last 2 decades. Many have settled in what experts call the wildland-urban interface, or WUL, the border zones where human development meets flammable landscapes. In suburbs around Austin, San Antonio, Dallas-Fort Worth, and Houston, homes are built close to grasslands and wooded areas. These communities enjoy natural beauty, but they also sit on the front line of wildfire danger. When fire spreads through the WI, the stakes multiply. It is not just trees and pastures at risk, but families, schools, and entire neighborhoods. A fourth factor is infrastructure. Texas has vast electrical networks, oil and gas operations, and highways stretching across its land. Each of these systems can spark fires. In 2011, downed power lines triggered the Bastrop Complex fire, which destroyed over 1,600 homes. In other cases, sparks from welding equipment or machinery have ignited brush. Even vehicles pulled over on dry grass can start blazes when hot exhaust systems touch brittle vegetation. The combination of flammable landscapes and widespread human activity creates countless ignition points. Together, these factors explain why Texas is now at such high risk. But the vulnerability is not only physical, it is also systemic. Many rural counties rely on volunteer fire departments, often with limited equipment and small crews. When flames erupt, these departments can be overwhelmed within hours. They rely on state support, but without early declarations like Abbott's, reinforcements may arrive too late. In a state this large, response time is critical. Fires can grow exponentially while crews are still mobilizing. History has already delivered warnings. The 2011 wildfire season was catastrophic, burning over 4 million acres. The 2017 Panhandle fires killed 7 people and destroyed thousands of cattle. The 2022 Eastland Complex fire burned 54,000 acres and forced mass evacuations. And in 2025, even before Abbott's August declaration, fires in Sam Houston National Forest and Port Bolivar showed that no region is immune. Each event underscores the same truth. Texas is no longer safe from the kind of fires once thought of as California's problem. What makes this especially urgent is the overlap of disasters. In July 2025, Texas endured deadly floods that killed over 100 people. Now, weeks later, it faces wildfire danger at unprecedented levels. This cycle of extremes, floods one month, fires the next, is straining both communities and state systems. Residents who just rebuilt from floods may face evacuation again due to fire. Emergency funds are stretched thin. Local leaders struggle to prepare for multiple, overlapping crises. This is what vulnerability looks like in practice, not just the risk of one disaster, but the piling up of many. For Texans, these vulnerabilities are personal. Farmers worry about crops that could be lost in flames. Ranchers worry about herds with no pasture left to graze. Parents worry about children exposed to smoke. Small business owners worry that one fire could erase their livelihoods. And across the state, ordinary families now wonder if their homes, often their single greatest asset, are secure. The big picture is clear. Texas is vulnerable because of where it is, how its climate is changing, how quickly its population has grown, and how its infrastructure interacts with fragile ecosystems. Every one of these vulnerabilities compounds the others, and together they create a risk profile that places Texas among the states most likely to experience catastrophic wildfires in the years ahead. The question now is not whether Texas will burn, but how prepared it will be when it does. Governor Abbott's disaster declaration is one step, but as we will see, addressing vulnerability requires more than paperwork. It requires systemic change. In the next parts of this video, we will dive deeper into the science of fire weather, the human costs of vulnerability, and the choices Texas faces as it confronts a future where wildfires are not the exception, but the rule. To understand why Texas is becoming increasingly vulnerable to wildfires, we must dive deeper into the science of fire weather. Wildfires are not random acts of destruction. They are the outcome of specific environmental conditions that align in dangerous ways. When those conditions overlap, they create what experts call a perfect storm for ignition and spread. In Texas during 2025, nearly every ingredient in that recipe is present. Meteorologists and wildfire scientists often describe fire behavior using what is known as the fire triangle: fuel, weather, and topography. Fuel refers to the vegetation and organic material that burns. Weather encompasses heat, humidity, and wind. Topography shapes how fire moves across landscapes. In Texas, each side of this triangle is trending toward greater danger. Let's start with fuel. The vegetation across Texas is abundant and varied. In East Texas, thick pine forests dominate. In Central Texas, oak woodlands and cedar brush spread across rolling hills. In the Panhandle, tall grasses cover the open plains. All of these fuel types can burn under the right conditions. Drought transforms living vegetation into brittle fuel, while dead leaves, branches, and grasses accumulate year after year, building layers of combustible material. Without regular, low-intensity fires to clear this buildup, landscapes become primed for high-intensity blazes. The drought of 2025 has only magnified the problem. Large sections of Texas have been in severe to exceptional drought for months. Soil moisture has plummeted, crops have withered, and rivers have run low. Scientists measure drought intensity using indicators like the Palmer Drought Severity Index and soil moisture anomalies, and by midsummer, Texas was registering among the worst readings in decades. This means that when fire ignites, it burns hotter, spreads faster, and resists suppression. Weather compounds the risk. Heat waves have blanketed Texas, with days consistently reaching well into the triple digits. Each degree of temperature increase dries vegetation more quickly, lowering its moisture content. Wildfire researchers often track fuel moisture, the percentage of water content in vegetation. Once grasses fall below about 10% fuel moisture, they can ignite almost instantly. In the summer of 2025, many regions of Texas reported fuel moistures well below that threshold, essentially guaranteeing flammability. Humidity plays a critical role as well. Fires spread most aggressively when relative humidity drops below 20%. Dry air draws moisture out of fuels, making them more receptive to sparks. During recent heat waves, relative humidity in parts of central Texas fell into the teens. Combined with high temperatures, this created explosive fire conditions. Then there is wind, the accelerant that turns a small brush fire into a regional catastrophe. Texas is exposed to strong, shifting wind patterns. Dry air masses sweep in from the high plains, while Gulf breezes push inland from the coast. When cold fronts arrive, winds can gust up to 40 miles per hour. Fire crews know that wind-driven fires are the hardest to fight because embers can leap across containment lines, igniting spot fires miles away. During the Bastrop Fire of 2011, wind gusts carried embers far ahead of the main flame front, overwhelming fire breaks and trapping neighborhoods. In 2025, similar wind patterns are already setting the stage for new disasters. Topography also plays a role. While Texas is not mountainous like California or Colorado, its varied landscapes still influence fire spread. Fires burn uphill faster than downhill, and the hill country's rolling terrain can funnel winds, accelerating flames. In grasslands, flat terrain allows fire to race across miles of fuel in a matter of hours. Each region presents unique challenges for firefighters trying to predict and contain fire behavior. Climate change is another layer shaping Texas's vulnerability. Scientific studies show that rising global temperatures are intensifying droughts and heat waves. Warmer air holds more moisture, leading to heavier rainfall events followed by longer dry spells. This cycle of feast or famine rainfall is exactly what Texas has experienced in recent years. In July 2025, torrential rains caused deadly floods. Weeks later, the same regions were parched and primed for fire. This volatility, sometimes called climate whiplash, makes planning far more difficult. Communities must prepare for floods and fires in the same season, stretching resources and resilience. Another critical concept is the energy release component, or ERC, used by fire managers to gauge potential fire intensity. ERC values combine data on temperature, humidity, and fuel moisture to estimate how much energy a fire would release if it ignited. In Texas during summer 2025, ERC values soared above the 90th percentile in many regions, meaning fire conditions were more extreme than in 9 out of 10 previous years on record. For fire crews, this is a flashing red warning. Any fire that starts will be unusually hard to control. Beyond the science of weather, there is the science of ignition. In Texas, most wildfires are human-caused. According to Texas A&M Forest Service data, over 90% of fires in the state are started by people through debris burning, equipment use, power lines, or accidents. Lightning does ignite fires, particularly during summer storms, but it is human activity that drives the vast majority of incidents. This means that vulnerability is not only a natural phenomenon, it is directly tied to how people live, work, and move through the landscape. The intersection of human activity and weather creates compounding risks. For example, during extreme heat, power lines sag and may snap, sparking dry grass. High winds then carry embers across fields, starting multiple fires at once. Firefighters must divide their resources, reducing their ability to contain any one blaze. Or consider oil and gas infrastructure, which stretches across much of Texas. Equipment malfunctions, pipeline leaks, or sparks from drilling operations can ignite fires that spread into nearby vegetation. With drought as the backdrop, even a small accident can escalate into a regional emergency. The scientific picture is clear. Texas is facing converging risk factors. Abundant fuels, extreme drought, soaring temperatures, low humidity, and strong winds combine to create a landscape primed for fire. Add in human activity that sparks most ignitions, and you have the formula for disaster. What makes 2025 especially alarming is that these conditions are not isolated. They cover much of the state simultaneously. This is why Abbott's disaster declaration included 191 counties. The danger is not localized, it is statewide. For Texans, the science may seem abstract, but its consequences are deeply real. It explains why families are told to clear brush from around their homes, why counties enforce burn bans, and why fire danger ratings flash on roadside signs. It explains why a single afternoon can transform from ordinary to catastrophic. And it explains why leadership must act before flames spread, rather than after. The science of fire weather does not offer easy solutions, but it does provide foresight. By monitoring fuel moisture, ERC values, and wind forecasts, fire managers can anticipate danger zones. By educating the public on ignition risks, officials can reduce the number of preventable fires. And by acknowledging the role of climate change, policymakers can begin to plan for a hotter, drier, more volatile future. Texas, then, is not just vulnerable by chance. It is vulnerable because science shows us the risks are real, measurable, and rising. The challenge is whether science will guide action quickly enough to prevent history from repeating itself. Behind every wildfire statistic is a human face, a family, and a community. Numbers alone, acres burned, dollars lost, homes destroyed, can never fully capture the reality of what it means to live with wildfire risk in Texas. To understand why the state is so vulnerable, we need to explore not only the science, but also the lived experience of those who call fire-prone regions home. The human cost begins with displacement. When evacuation orders come, families must leave behind the familiarity of their homes and the security of their daily lives. For some, evacuation is temporary, a night or two in a shelter until fire lines are contained. For others, it becomes permanent, as flames consume everything they owned. In Texas, where many rural families have lived on the same land for generations, the loss of a home is also the loss of history, identity, and community. Consider the Bastrop County fires of 2011. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to ash within days. Families returned to find nothing but chimneys standing, the sole markers of where houses once stood. Children lost their bedrooms, parents lost irreplaceable family photographs, and communities lost the sense of continuity that binds them together. The scars from that event linger to this day. In 2025, when Governor Abbott's disaster declaration was announced, many Texans in Bastrop and elsewhere felt an immediate sense of déjà vu. They know too well what can happen when conditions align against them. Agriculture, the backbone of much of Texas's rural economy, suffers deeply from wildfire. Ranchers may lose not only land, but also livestock. Cattle caught in advancing flames face injury or death, and the pastures that sustain them can take years to recover. A single wildfire can wipe out an entire year's worth of grazing. Fences, barns, and water systems are often destroyed, leaving ranchers with not only the emotional pain of loss, but also crushing financial burdens. Farmers, too, face devastation as crops are destroyed, soil becomes degraded, and ash contaminates irrigation supplies. For small family operations, recovery may never come. Health is another profound dimension of vulnerability. Even for those far from the flames, wildfire smoke carries fine particles that penetrate deep into the lungs. In cities hundreds of miles away, skies turn orange and the smell of smoke permeates the air. Emergency rooms see spikes in cases of asthma attacks, respiratory distress, and heart complications. For children, the elderly, and those with pre-existing conditions, wildfire smoke is not merely uncomfortable, it is dangerous. Public health officials warn residents to stay indoors, but for many outdoor workers, farmers, delivery drivers, staying inside is not an option. Thus, vulnerability spreads beyond fire zones, enveloping entire regions in its haze. The psychological cost is harder to measure, but equally devastating. Living under constant threat wears down mental resilience. Anxiety spikes each time the wind picks up or the sky darkens with smoke. Families who lost homes in past fires may feel paralyzed by fear when new warnings are issued. Volunteer firefighters, who are often neighbors and friends rather than career professionals, bear enormous stress. They work exhausting shifts, risk their lives, and sometimes fail despite their best efforts. The burden of loss and responsibility can lead to depression, burnout, and post-traumatic stress disorder. Communities may rally in the immediate aftermath, but as months pass and media attention fades, survivors often feel forgotten, left to navigate trauma on their own. Vulnerability is not evenly distributed. Wealthier families may have the resources to rebuild quickly, buy insurance, or relocate to safer areas. Low-income families, immigrants, and elderly residents often lack such options. Mobile home parks, common in rural Texas, are particularly vulnerable. Structures are highly flammable, evacuation routes limited, and residents less likely to have financial safety nets. Language barriers can further complicate evacuation and aid efforts. When Abbott's disaster declaration promised state resources, advocates quickly emphasized the need for equitable distribution, ensuring that the most vulnerable, not just the most visible, receive help. Community infrastructure also suffers in ways that compound human vulnerability. Fires can damage water treatment plants, leaving residents without safe drinking water. Power lines collapse, plunging neighborhoods into darkness at precisely the moment when communication is most critical. Cell towers burn, cutting off emergency alerts. Roads buckle under heat or are blocked by fallen trees, delaying evacuations and aid delivery. When critical infrastructure fails, even communities untouched by flames feel the disruption. Businesses close, schools shut down, and local economies grind to a halt. Insurance markets reflect and amplify these vulnerabilities. In high-risk areas, premiums skyrocket, and some insurers withdraw altogether. Homeowners face the painful choice of paying unaffordable rates, going without coverage, or abandoning their property. For many, their home is their largest investment, and without insurance, that investment becomes precarious. Communities with widespread uninsured losses struggle to recover, and property values collapse. Vulnerability becomes a cycle. Fire risk drives economic decline, which reduces resilience, which in turn makes communities even more vulnerable to the next disaster. The cultural cost is also significant. Texas has a strong sense of place, rural pride, local traditions, and family ties to the land. When fires erase homes, farms, and landscapes, they also erase part of that cultural identity. Sacred sites, historic buildings, and community landmarks are lost. Forests that served as gathering places or sources of pride for generations can be gone in days. Residents often describe this as losing not only property, but also part of themselves. Despite all of this, resilience shines through. Texans have a long tradition of helping neighbors, of rallying to support one another in times of crisis. Churches become shelters, schools host donation drives, and strangers share food, water, and labor. Volunteer firefighters step forward with courage, often risking everything to save their towns. This culture of mutual aid is one of Texas's greatest assets, and it mitigates vulnerability in powerful ways. But even resilience has limits. Without systemic support, funding, planning, infrastructure, community strength alone cannot withstand endless cycles of destruction and recovery. Governor Abbott's disaster declaration acknowledges these human costs. It is not only about mobilizing aircraft and bulldozers, it is about recognizing that people, not just landscapes, are at risk. It signals that the state understands vulnerability is lived daily by those who cannot afford to lose what little they have. Yet the true test will be in the months ahead, whether resources reach those most in need, whether recovery is equitable, and whether the lessons of past disasters lead to real change. The human cost of wildfire in Texas is profound and layered. It is measured in lives displaced, health compromised, livelihoods destroyed, and communities fractured. Vulnerability is not an abstract concept. It is what happens when a child breathes smoke, when a rancher loses cattle, when a grandmother cannot evacuate in time. These stories remind us that preparing for wildfire is not just about fire trucks and policy. It is about protecting people, their dignity, and their future. In the next part of this video, we will examine how politics and leadership intersect with vulnerability. Because ultimately, the choices of leaders, how they allocate resources, how they communicate risks, and how they plan for the future, determine whether human costs are minimized or magnified. When fire threatens lives and communities, the science of weather and fuel is only half the story. The other half is leadership. Wildfire vulnerability in Texas is not simply a matter of geography or climate. It is also shaped by the decisions of political leaders, the policies of governments, and the priorities of institutions. In this sense, wildfires become political tests. They reveal whether leaders can anticipate threats, allocate resources fairly, and maintain the trust of citizens in times of crisis. Governor Greg Abbott's August 2025 disaster declaration is a prime example. On one level, it was a practical step, mobilizing agencies, unlocking funding, and ensuring that 191 counties were legally recognized as being under heightened fire risk. But on another level, it was a political act. By declaring early, Abbott projected an image of foresight and control. He signaled to Texans that their government was not waiting for catastrophe, but preparing for it. For a state that has endured recent disasters, the July floods, earlier wildfires, and years of climate extremes, this proactive stance carried political weight. Yet leadership in wildfire management is never simple. Declarations must be followed by effective action, and action is always constrained by politics. Budget decisions determine whether volunteer fire departments receive the equipment they need, Policy choices decide whether development is allowed in high-risk zones. Political ideology shapes whether leaders frame fires as part of broader climate change or treat them as isolated natural events. In Texas, where debates over government intervention run deep, these choices are especially contested. At the heart of the political challenge is funding. Rural Texas is vast, and most firefighting is carried out by small volunteer departments. These departments often lack modern trucks, protective gear, or advanced training. They rely on county budgets, donations, and occasional state grants. When large fires strike, they can be quickly overwhelmed. State resources such as the Texas A&M Forest Service and the National Guard can reinforce them, but this requires funding at the state level. Critics argue that Texas has underinvested in fire prevention and suppression infrastructure, leaving local communities vulnerable. Supporters counter that the state has steadily expanded resources since the devastating 2011 season. Both sides agree, however, that money shapes capacity, and capacity shapes survival. Another layer of politics lies in communication. Leadership during wildfires is not just about deploying crews, it is about keeping the public informed. Clear, consistent messaging builds trust and saves lives. Confusing or contradictory messages, on the other hand, create chaos. In recent disasters across the US, delayed or poorly communicated evacuation orders have cost lives. In Texas, the responsibility for communication is shared among county judges, local emergency managers, and the governor's office. This distribution of authority reflects Texas's strong tradition of local control, but it can also create fragmentation. Residents sometimes receive mixed signals about when to leave or how serious the danger is. Strong leadership requires coordination across all levels of government, something that disaster declarations attempt to streamline. Leadership also intersects with questions of equity. Vulnerability is not uniform across Texas. Wealthy suburbs may have well-funded fire departments and residents with the means to evacuate quickly. Low-income communities, immigrant families, and rural towns often lack such advantages. Political leaders face the challenge of ensuring that resources are distributed fairly, not just to the loudest or most visible constituencies. Advocates warn that without equity, disaster response can deepen inequality, leaving some communities to rebuild while others are left behind. Abbott's declaration covered 191 counties, but the real test is whether aid reaches the most vulnerable residents within those counties. Partisan politics further complicates wildfire leadership. Climate change is a politically charged issue in Texas, as in much of the US. While scientists point to rising temperatures and extreme weather as key drivers of fire risk, political leaders often avoid direct discussion of climate change. Some prefer to frame wildfires as natural cycles or emphasize personal responsibility over systemic causes. This approach can limit long-term planning. Addressing wildfire vulnerability requires confronting climate realities, investing in drought resilience, sustainable land management, and infrastructure capable of withstanding extremes. When leaders sidestep these discussions, communities may be left unprepared for the future. At the same time, political dynamics influence collaboration between state and federal agencies. Texas has historically emphasized independence and sometimes clashed with federal authorities. But wildfires, like hurricanes, often demand federal assistance. FEMA funds, US Forest Service teams, and cross-state mutual aid can all be critical in major fire seasons. Effective leadership requires balancing state pride with pragmatic cooperation. Abbott's disaster declaration positioned Texas to request federal aid if needed, but whether that aid arrives promptly depends on politics in Washington as well as Austin. The role of leadership extends beyond immediate response to long-term prevention. Policies on zoning, land management, and building codes all influence vulnerability. Allowing development in fire-prone areas increases risk, but limiting development can spark political backlash from landowners and developers. Requiring fire-resistant construction can save lives, but it can also raise housing costs, an unpopular move in a state already struggling with affordability. Leaders must weigh safety against economic and political pressures, and too often, short-term gains win over long-term resilience. Public perception also shapes political outcomes. Disasters are moments of heightened scrutiny. A governor who responds effectively may see a surge in approval. A leader perceived as slow or negligent can face lasting damage. For Abbott, whose administration was criticized during Winter Storm Uri in 2021, demonstrating competence in wildfire response is politically crucial. The memory of power outages and unheated homes still lingers, and many Texans will compare today's response to past failures. If Abbott's wildfire management is seen as timely and effective, it could repair trust. If not, it could reinforce doubts about the state's ability to protect its people. Leadership is also about symbolism. Declaring a disaster signals urgency, but it also shapes the public's narrative. Texans are proud of resilience, but they also expect their leaders to acknowledge reality. Downplaying risks may temporarily calm fears, but it undermines trust when disasters inevitably strike. By contrast, acknowledging risks openly can empower communities to prepare. The language leaders use, whether they frame fires as temporary challenges or existential threats, affects how people think and act. In the end, politics and leadership are inseparable from wildfire vulnerability. Resources, communication, equity, ideology, and public perception all determine how effectively Texas can respond to fire risk. Abbott's declaration may be remembered as an example of foresight, or it may be criticized as political theater. The outcome will depend not just on the weather, but on the decisions made in offices and state houses across Texas. What is clear is that leadership matters. When fires ignite, minutes can mean the difference between containment and catastrophe. When disasters displace families, decisions about aid can mean the difference between recovery and despair. And when climate extremes reshape the state, the courage to plan for the future can mean the difference between resilience and recurring tragedy. As Texas continues to face wildfire vulnerability, the role of its leaders will remain central. They are tasked not only with managing crises, but with guiding the state toward a safer future. Whether they succeed will depend on their willingness to confront hard truths, invest in resilience, and put people before politics. The flames of the next wildfire will test not only the land, but the integrity of Texas leadership itself. The story of Texas wildfire vulnerability is not just about what might happen in the future, it is about what has already happened. Each major blaze in the state's history serves as both a warning and a lesson. For many Texans, the scars of past fires are still visible, etched into the land and into memory. To understand why the 2025 wildfire disaster declaration matters, we need to revisit this history and recognize the patterns it reveals. The most infamous wildfire season in Texas came in 2011, a year that remains etched into collective memory. The drought that year was historic, by many measures the driest 12-month period in Texas history. Reservoirs shrank, crops failed, and vegetation turned into powder-dry fuel. Over the course of that year, more than 30,000 wildfires ignited, consuming over 4 million acres. That is an area larger than the entire state of Connecticut. Thousands of homes were lost, billions of dollars in damage accrued, and entire communities were reshaped. At the center of that catastrophe was the Bastrop County Complex Fire. Sparked on September 4th by downed power lines, the blaze roared to life under the influence of high winds from Tropical Storm Lee. Within hours, flames were racing through neighborhoods. Over several weeks, the fire destroyed more than 1,600 homes and 34,000 acres, killing 2 people and devastating the iconic Lost Pines Forest. For many Texans, the images of Bastrop became the symbol of wildfire horror. The day suburban homes were swallowed as quickly as ranchland and forest. The lessons of Bastrop were sobering. Power infrastructure was revealed as a critical vulnerability. Evacuation routes proved insufficient as families scrambled to escape, and the underfunding of rural fire departments became glaringly obvious as volunteers struggled against a fire of unprecedented scale. Afterward, reforms were promised. But as with many disasters, urgency faded once headlines moved on. The years after 2011 brought more reminders. In 2015, another fire swept through Bastrop County, burning more than 4,500 acres and destroying dozens of homes. Though smaller, it reopened wounds and underscored that risk had not diminished. Residents who rebuilt after 2011 found themselves once again fleeing flames, proof that wildfire vulnerability does not end once rebuilding begins. In 2017, the Texas Panhandle became the stage for another tragedy. A series of wildfires, driven by strong winds and dry grasses, killed 7 people and burned nearly 500,000 acres. Ranchers lost thousands of cattle, wiping out livelihoods that had been built over generations. Families died while trying to move livestock out of harm's way, caught by flames that moved faster than vehicles could outrun. This was not suburban fire risk, it was rural devastation, highlighting how every region of Texas has its own unique vulnerabilities. More recently, the Eastland Complex fire of March 2022 reignited statewide concern. That fire consumed over 54,000 acres, destroyed 140 structures, and forced mass evacuations. At least 1 person was killed. What made Eastland particularly alarming was its location. It burned west of the Dallas-Fort Worth metroplex, raising the frightening possibility of large-scale wildfire encroaching on heavily populated urban areas. Texans realized that fire was no longer a distant rural issue. It could threaten suburbs and cities. In 2023 and 2024, a series of smaller but still destructive fires struck the hill country in East Texas, burning ranchland and forests and forcing evacuations. While not as catastrophic as Bastrop or Eastland, these events reinforced the persistence of wildfire risk. Texans were reminded that every summer carried danger, that every drought deepened vulnerability. And then came 2025. Earlier in the year, the Sam Houston National Forest fire burned nearly 2,400 acres. For residents of East Texas, seeing a national forest, the pride of their region, ablaze was a visceral shock. In July, a 160-acre fire near Port Bolivar along the Gulf Coast raised new alarms. Fires on the coast are rare, but extreme heat and drought had dried marshland enough to ignite. Suddenly, Texans realized that no region, forest, prairie, or coastline was immune. Abbott's August declaration was made against this backdrop, a state already experiencing fire on all fronts. What do these historical events teach us? First, they show that vulnerability is statewide. From Bastrop to the Panhandle, from Eastland to the Gulf Coast, no corner of Texas is safe. The idea that wildfires are only a problem for California is long outdated. Texas has had some of the largest, most destructive fires in the nation, and the risk is only increasing. Second, history shows that fire seasons can escalate rapidly. In 2011, small brush fires ignited almost daily until the state was overwhelmed. In 2017, multiple fires struck simultaneously, stretching resources thin. In 2022, one fire near Eastland required mass evacuations within hours. These events reveal how quickly conditions can deteriorate, leaving little time for preparation. That is why disaster declarations matter before flames spread. Waiting until multiple fires rage at once is a recipe for tragedy. Third, past fires highlight systemic weaknesses. Underfunded rural fire departments, fragile power infrastructure, and inadequate evacuation routes all contributed to losses. While improvements have been made, these weaknesses persist. Many departments still rely on aging equipment. Power lines remain vulnerable in extreme heat and wind. Rural residents still face limited escape routes. History shows that unless these issues are addressed, the same vulnerabilities will lead to the same outcomes. Fourth, history reveals the long shadow of wildfire trauma. Survivors of Bastrop, the Panhandle, and Eastland carry memories that shape their response to new threats. For some, disaster declarations bring reassurance that the state is alert. For others, they reopen old wounds and heighten anxiety. Trauma is part of vulnerability. It shapes how communities perceive risk, how they prepare, and how they recover. Finally, the timeline of Texas wildfires tells us that climate extremes are changing the rhythm of disaster. Fires are starting earlier, lasting longer, and appearing in regions once thought safe. Floods and fires now occur within weeks of each other. Texans are learning that disaster seasons overlap, leaving little room to recover. As Abbott's August 2025 declaration demonstrates, leadership today is built on the lessons of yesterday. The ghosts of Bastrop, the tragedy of the Panhandle, the evacuations of Eastland all hang over Texas's present. They are not distant memories, but warnings etched in ash. The history of Texas wildfires is not only a record of loss, but a guide for the future. Act early, prepare broadly, invest deeply, and never underestimate the flames. For Texas, vulnerability to wildfire is not a temporary crisis. but a long-term challenge that requires preparation, adaptation, and resilience. As we conclude this exploration of why Texas is increasingly vulnerable, it is vital to look at the choices that lie before communities, leaders, and individuals across the state. The first step toward resilience is prevention. Wildfire experts emphasize that the most effective fire is the one that never ignites. Preventive measures may sound mundane, clearing brush, maintaining power lines, enforcing burn bans, but they are critical. Utility companies must continue upgrading infrastructure to prevent sparks from sagging lines during heat waves. Landowners must maintain defensible space around homes, ensuring that grass and brush do not form a direct bridge for flames. State and local governments must invest in prescribed burns, which reduce fuel buildup safely and restore natural fire cycles. Prevention requires effort long before smoke rises, but it saves lives and billions of dollars in the long run. Preparedness is the second key. Communities cannot control the weather, but they can control how ready they are when fire strikes. Local governments need detailed evacuation plans that consider traffic choke points and vulnerable populations. Schools, nursing homes, and hospitals must have protocols for rapid evacuation. Families need go bags with essentials ready at all times. Preparedness also means training. Volunteer firefighters need modern equipment and consistent support. Investing in their capacity is not optional, it is essential. In Texas, where vast areas are protected by small departments, state and federal funding must bridge the gap. Technology offers a powerful third tool. Modern fire management increasingly relies on satellites, drones, and predictive models. Satellites can detect hotspots within minutes, while drones can map fire perimeters in real time. Artificial intelligence can predict where fire is most likely to spread based on weather, vegetation, and topography. Equipping rural departments with access to these tools will transform response capacity. But technology must be matched with training and funding. Without investment, it risks becoming yet another resource concentrated in urban centers while rural communities remain exposed. Urban planning and policy reform form the fourth frontier. Texas's rapid population growth has pushed housing into fire-prone areas, creating the wildland-urban interface where vulnerability is highest. Leaders must confront hard questions about where and how communities are built. Zoning policies that discourage dense development in high-risk areas, building codes that require fire-resistant materials, and community designs that incorporate defensible greenbelts can all reduce vulnerability. These measures are politically difficult. They can raise costs and face pushback from developers, but the alternative is building homes destined to burn. Climate adaptation represents the fifth challenge. Scientists are clear. Rising temperatures and shifting rainfall patterns are making Texas more fire-prone. Policymakers may debate the causes, but the impacts are undeniable. Addressing them means investing in water conservation, drought-resistant agriculture, renewable energy, and sustainable land management. It also means acknowledging that flood and fire risks are connected. Parched soils after wildfires are more prone to flash floods. Adaptation must be holistic, treating climate extremes as a system rather than isolated events. For Texas, this requires long-term vision, something often scarce in political cycles but essential for survival. Equity is the sixth pillar of resilience. Disasters do not affect all Texans equally. Wealthier families may rebuild quickly, while low-income households may never recover. Immigrant communities may face barriers in accessing aid. Elderly residents may lack the mobility to evacuate safely. Equity requires deliberate action, multilingual communication, targeted support for vulnerable groups, and fair distribution of aid. It also requires involving communities in decision-making, ensuring that resilient strategies are shaped not only by officials, but also by the people most at risk. Resilience is also cultural. Texans are known for grit, independence, and community spirit. Those traits are invaluable in times of crisis, but they must be nurtured. Education campaigns can embed fire awareness into daily life, just as hurricane preparation has become second nature along the Gulf Coast. Schools can teach children about evacuation planning and fire safety. Media outlets can highlight preparedness tips. Over time, this creates a culture of readiness, where every Texan knows their role when danger comes. The economic dimension cannot be ignored. Insurance markets are already responding to wildfire risk, raising premiums or pulling out of high-risk regions. Without intervention, this could trigger a housing crisis in vulnerable areas. State and federal leaders must explore solutions: risk pools, subsidies for mitigation, or incentives for fire-resistant construction. Without economic resilience, physical resilience will falter. Families must feel confident that preparing for wildfire does not mean financial ruin. Leadership will remain the deciding factor. Declarations like Abbott's are important, but they must be matched by long-term investment. Political courage is needed to fund prevention, enforce regulations, and acknowledge climate realities. Leaders must also maintain public trust by communicating clearly and acting decisively. In the end, Texans will judge their leaders not by speeches, but by whether communities survive and recover. The path forward is not easy. Fires will come, and some will still destroy homes, businesses, and lives. But the scale of devastation can be reduced. Vulnerability can be managed. Resilience can be built. It will require prevention, preparedness, technology, planning, adaptation, equity, culture, economics, and leadership, working together as one system. Perhaps the most important step is recognizing that wildfire is not an anomaly in Texas. It is part of its future. Accepting this truth allows communities to act with urgency rather than denial. Every acre cleared of excess fuel, every power line upgraded, every family prepared makes a difference. Small actions add up to resilience. As we close, remember that vulnerability is not destiny. Texas may face high risk, but it also possesses extraordinary resources, vast knowledge, resilient communities, and a culture of determination. The flames will test the state again, but with foresight and courage, Texans can meet those tests. The question is not whether wildfires will return. They will. The question is how prepared Texas will be when they do. And if you've stayed with us until the end, we invite you to be part of this journey. Subscribe to Crisis Lens to follow our ongoing coverage of natural disasters and their impact. Like this video if you believe awareness is the first step toward resilience. And most importantly, share it with your friends and communities, because the more people understand these risks, the stronger we all become. Together, we can face the future with knowledge, preparation,